The rain fell in a steady, relentless rhythm, drumming against the leaves and the muddy path that stretched before the two monks. Each droplet seemed to carry the weight of the world, pressing down on the quiet forest and the small river that twisted like a silver ribbon through the valley. The monks, cloaked in simple robes that had seen many seasons, walked slowly, their feet sinking slightly into the wet earth with each step. The air was thick with the scent of rain and the faint, earthy perfume of moss and soil, and yet within that heaviness there was a peculiar stillness, a moment that felt suspended between time and eternity. One monk, older and serene, moved with a calm deliberation, his eyes tracing the familiar contours of the forest as if he could read the stories etched into every tree and stone. His companion, younger and restless, kept glancing at the sky, at the swollen river, and at the path ahead, his mind a turbulent river of thoughts that mirrored the one they were about to cross. Despite the rain, despite the discomfort of wet robes and the chill that seeped through the air, neither monk spoke. Words in moments like this often felt unnecessary, even burdensome. Yet, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They were travelers, yes, but not merely of the physical world. Their journey was a meditation in motion, a practice of awareness, and a test of the heart. Every step carried intention. Every glance, however fleeting, held attention. And on this day, as the river roared beside the path, the boundary between the seen and the unseen seemed thinner, as if the rain itself was whispering secrets meant only for those willing to listen. As they neared the riverbank, the path became slick with mud, and the current of the river was louder than they expected, pounding against the rocks with a ferocity that made the trees tremble. The younger monk paused, instinctively sensing the danger that lay ahead. His mind, always quick to judge and assess, measured the risk. The older monk, however, simply stepped forward, letting the water's roar fill the silence around them. There was a quiet courage in his movement, a willingness to face what was in front of him without hesitation, without the need for calculation. It was in this moment, on this ordinary yet extraordinary rainy day, that the boundary of the monk's world was about to be challenged. A figure appeared on the opposite bank, momentarily illuminated by the gray light of the storm. A young woman, her robes clinging to her body, her expression a mixture of fear and helplessness. She was stranded, unable to cross the river that now surged like a living creature, impatient and unforgiving. The sight of her stirred something in both monks, though in very different ways. The older monk's heart softened immediately, a natural response of compassion and understanding. The younger monk, on the other hand, felt a tightening within himself, a conflict he could not yet name. In that split second, before words could form, before any action was taken, the entire lesson of their journey seemed to condense into one simple truth. Life does not wait for hesitation. The river does not pause for doubt, and the human heart, in its most honest and raw state, will always speak the language of need. As they stood at the edge of the river, soaked to the bone and shivering slightly, the rain blurring the line between land and water, a quiet tension hung in the air. The monks understood the rules of their path, the teachings they had studied for years, the discipline they had cultivated. And yet, as the young woman called out for help, that discipline would be tested in ways neither of them could have anticipated. In that moment, there was no thought of right or wrong, no calculation of consequence, only the pressing reality of the life before them. And as the older monk took a careful step toward her, moving with the calm certainty of someone who has seen both suffering and joy, the younger monk felt a question begin to form deep within himself, a question that would not let him rest for a long time. It was a simple day, a day of rain and mud, of cold and discomfort. Yet, as all true lessons begin, it was on this ordinary day by the river that an extraordinary journey of the heart was about to unfold. A journey that would challenge what they thought they knew about rules, about compassion, and about the very nature of letting go. The river roared, the rain fell, and in that quiet, wet, and chaotic moment, the two monks took the first steps toward an encounter that would linger in the mind far longer than the memory of the storm itself. The rain had eased to a gentle drizzle, leaving the forest glistening, each leaf and stone sparkling as if touched by tiny stars. The river, now calmer but still murmuring with life, seemed to echo the quiet rhythm of the monks' footsteps. Walking side by side, the two men moved with contrasting energies, though neither spoke. One carried the weight of experience, the other the restlessness of youth, and between them flowed an invisible dialogue of observation and contemplation. The older monk, with his face lined not only by years but by countless reflections on impermanence, walked with a lightness that seemed almost impossible for one who had endured so much. His robe, damp but untangled by worry, clung to him without fuss. Each step was deliberate, yet effortless, a testament to a lifetime of practice and surrender. In his eyes there was a calm curiosity, a constant awareness of both the external and internal worlds, like a river flowing steadily, unaffected by the storms around it. The younger monk, however, was a different current altogether. His mind leaped ahead, anticipating obstacles, measuring dangers, questioning the choices they had made along this path. Every snapping branch, every rustle of unseen creatures stirred him into alertness. Yet beneath that restlessness, there was a yearning, a desire to understand, to master, to be certain of his place in the unfolding world. He had come to these woods seeking wisdom, yet wisdom seemed slippery, always shifting just beyond reach, much like the river they had just crossed. As they continued their journey, the landscape unfolded like a living tapestry. Moss-draped trees leaned toward the river as if whispering secrets, birds called across the canopy in calls both mournful and celebratory, and the wind carried stories of distant mountains. To the untrained eye, it was simply a forest, a river, a path. But to the monks, it was a canvas of lessons, patience, observation, humility. Each step offered a mirror to their own hearts. The older monk, sensing the younger one's turbulence, occasionally spoke, not with the tone of correction but with the gentle cadence of inquiry. "Do you feel the rain differently today?" he asked once, tilting his head slightly. The younger monk frowned, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. I feel the chill," he replied, unsure. The older monk smiled faintly. "The rain does not merely touch the skin. It touches the mind as well. Watch it, and perhaps it may teach you more than your fears ever could." They spoke little beyond these moments, for words were often inadequate. The true journey was not measured in miles, but in the subtle currents of thought, in the gentle reshaping of the mind's patterns. With every step, the younger monk became increasingly aware of his inner landscape, the habitual restlessness, the tight grip on rules and judgments, and the fear of stepping beyond the boundaries he had built around himself. Yet, despite the internal turbulence, there was progress. The older monk's silent presence acted as a counterweight, a steadying force that allowed insight to emerge organically rather than forced through effort. The path itself seemed to respond, guiding their movements, revealing subtle signs, patterns in the trees, the way the river curved, even the behavior of the birds, all speaking a language older than words. As the afternoon sun began to pierce the gray veil of clouds, the two monks reached a small clearing where the river widened, its current gentle but insistent. Here, the older monk paused, letting the silence settle like a tangible presence between them. "All journeys," he said softly, "are first journeys within. Before you move through the world, you must move through yourself. You must confront the storms inside as fiercely as the storms outside." The younger monk nodded, though he felt the weight of comprehension yet to come. He realized, in the stillness of that moment, that this journey was not about crossing rivers or walking paths. It was about observing the mind, witnessing desire and aversion, cultivating compassion and discernment, and slowly learning the art of letting go. Each step forward was also a step inward. And so, they continued, moving closer to a river bend where the next challenge awaited, a moment that would test not only their understanding of the teachings but the very essence of their hearts. For the path of a monk is never only about discipline. It is about encountering life as it is, and responding not with fear or hesitation, but with awareness and compassion. With every footfall, the younger monk felt the rhythm of the older monk's steps, not as a lesson imposed, but as a living example of what it meant to move through life with presence. The forest, the river, and the lingering rain had become silent teachers, shaping each moment, each choice, and preparing him unknowingly for the encounter that would soon demand more than observation. It would demand action. It was here, amidst the soft dripping of leaves and the gentle murmur of water, that the next chapter of their journey quietly waited, a test not of knowledge, not of adherence to rules, but of heart. The lessons of a lifetime could not prepare one fully for the immediacy of life's call. And yet, for those willing to move with awareness, even the simplest moments could become portals to wisdom. The monks approached the river bend, where the water widened and quickened, tumbling over jagged stones with a restless, almost impatient energy. The rain had tapered off to a fine mist, clinging to their hair and robes, leaving them damp but alert. It was then that they saw her, a young woman standing on the opposite bank, her figure small against the roaring expanse of water. She was trapped, unable to cross, her robes plastered to her skin, hair wet and clinging to her face. Fear flickered in her eyes, and in that moment it was raw and unfiltered, a silent plea that required no words. The older monk instinctively stepped forward, his gaze soft, open, and unhesitating. Compassion arose naturally without effort. The younger monk, however, froze for a heartbeat, his mind rushing through questions, rules, and boundaries. He thought of the teachings. Monks should not touch women, they should maintain detachment, they should not be distracted from the path. And yet, in that split second, he was confronted with a force stronger than doctrine, the immediacy of human need. The older monk spoke first, but his words were gentle, more an invitation than a command. "Do you need help?" he asked. She nodded, relief flashing briefly across her face, mingled with the fear of the rushing water. Her presence was at once vulnerable and commanding, an undeniable reality that demanded attention. The younger monk looked on, torn between adherence to tradition and the undeniable call of compassion. Time seemed to slow. Every sound, the river's roar, the wind brushing through the trees, the subtle drip of lingering rain, became heightened as if the universe itself held its breath. The older monk took off his wet sandals and stepped carefully toward the river, feeling the pull of the current through his feet. His movements were deliberate, each one measured, yet fluid, embodying the balance of mindfulness and courage. The younger monk watched, conflicted, as the older monk reached the woman. He saw how her body trembled not only from cold but from fear, how she clutched her wet robe to herself, and how her eyes, wide and trusting, sought a lifeline. In that gaze, the younger monk felt a tension within himself that no amount of rules could resolve, a tension between rigid understanding and living wisdom. Without hesitation, the older monk lifted her carefully, carrying her across the rushing water. He did so with a grace that belied the weight of her body, a movement born from practice, awareness, and unshakable presence. Each step was mindful, each motion intentional, each breath in harmony with the rhythm of the river. The younger monk remained on the bank, his heart pounding, mind racing. He tried to justify his hesitation, citing the rules, the vows, the teachings he had spent years following. Yet, deep within, he sensed a lesson he had not yet fully understood, a lesson not found in scriptures or lectures, but in the living moment, in the act of seeing and responding to human suffering without attachment, without hesitation. By the time the older monk placed the woman safely on the far bank, she shivered but smiled, gratitude breaking through the fear in her eyes. She bowed slightly, murmuring a word of thanks, and then with cautious steps continued on her way, disappearing into the misty forest. The older monk turned back to the younger, calm and composed, as if the crossing had been the most ordinary act in the world. But for the younger monk, the river still roared, not in his ears but in his mind. He could not let go of the sight of the woman, the moment of need, the decision his companion had made. It was as though the weight of the river had transferred to him, and he carried it silently, unspoken, heavy in his chest. Finally, Unable to hold back, he spoke, his voice low, tinged with both curiosity and frustration. "Why did you do it? You know the rules, you know what we are supposed to follow. Why touch her?" The older monk's gaze was steady, unwavering, a quiet mirror of understanding. "I left her at the river," he said simply. "You, on the other hand, are still carrying her." The words sank in, subtle yet profound, stirring something deep within the younger monk. It was more than an observation. It was a challenge, a revelation, a mirror reflecting the restlessness and attachment he had yet to release. The river behind them, now calm and steady, seemed almost to sigh, as if affirming the lesson it had silently imparted. In that encounter, the younger monk realized that wisdom was not measured by adherence to rules alone, nor by avoidance of action. True understanding arose from the balance of awareness and compassion, the courage to act without attachment, and the ability to release what no longer serves the heart. The river, the woman, and the older monk had become teachers in a single, flowing lesson, a lesson that could not be read or memorized, only lived. And so, the journey continued, but the landscape of the younger monk's mind had shifted, subtly yet irreversibly. Ahead lay questions yet unanswered, challenges yet unseen, and moments that would demand more than knowledge. They would demand heart, clarity, and the profound art of letting go. The river had quieted now, its turbulent roar replaced by a gentle murmur, like the soft exhale of a world that had just witnessed an extraordinary moment. The older monk stood on the far bank, soaked and chilled, but untouched by doubt. The young woman, trembling but unharmed, had been set safely on the earth, her gaze lingering for a moment in silent gratitude. There was no fanfare, no sense of triumph, only the quiet simplicity of an act performed from the depths of awareness and care. Compassion, in its purest form, often appears in moments that demand nothing of the world except presence. The older monk had acted not out of obligation or desire, not to prove himself, not to break a rule, but because the need was immediate and undeniable. To him, the river was not a barrier. The woman's fear was not a distraction. Both were simply conditions of reality, and reality, he knew, required engagement, not detachment in the form of hesitation. The younger monk, meanwhile, remained rooted on the bank, his eyes following every step the older monk had taken. His mind, previously sharp with judgment and hesitation, now twisted into quiet turmoil. He remembered the vows, the long hours of study, the teachings that emphasized discipline and restraint. And yet, in that single moment, all those principles collided with the undeniable truth of human need. A woman, alone and frightened, had required help, and she had received it. The older monk had crossed the invisible line of convention, and yet the world had not ended. The rules had not been broken, not in any meaningful sense, because the action had emerged from clarity, presence, and love. There was a lesson here, one that could not be taught in monasteries, nor found in any scripture, that the heart must sometimes speak louder than the mind. The act of compassion, though simple on the surface, carried layers of meaning. It was a testament to courage, the courage to move when hesitation whispers. It was a testament to mindfulness, the awareness that every moment is unique and that waiting for the perfect time often means doing nothing at all. And above all, it was a testament to release, the ability to act and then to let go, without clinging to recognition, judgment, or fear of reprisal. The young woman's departure left a quiet space in the clearing, a space where the younger monk could feel the weight of what had just occurred. His eyes met the older monk's, searching for reassurance, explanation, perhaps even permission to understand. The older monk simply nodded as if to say, "See clearly, feel clearly, release clearly." The younger monk's chest felt tight, a physical manifestation of the storm inside his mind. He wrestled with questions he could not yet answer. Had the older monk acted correctly? Had he transgressed the rules? Or had he simply demonstrated a wisdom that transcends rules, a wisdom born of understanding life in its full, unfiltered form? This internal struggle was not new. The younger monk had often wrestled with the tension between knowledge and practice, between what the mind dictates and what the heart compels. But this moment, this act of compassion, was different. It forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding, that living the teachings of the Buddha was not merely about memorization, nor blind adherence to rules, nor even avoidance of desire. It was about discerning the Dharma in real time and responding with a mind free of attachment, a heart open to the needs of others, and a courage tempered by awareness. As the wind stirred the mist and the river whispered its endless song, the younger monk took a step closer to the water, almost instinctively. He watched the ripples fade, leaving no trace of the action that had so profoundly disturbed his inner world. He realized then that the act itself was fleeting, ephemeral, like a wave that rises and falls with grace, and yet the lesson lingered, etched not in stone but in the heart. The older monk, sensing the younger's inner tension, did not offer explanation or argument. He understood that true learning comes from experience, from witnessing, from sitting with the tension and allowing insight to emerge naturally. In that silence, the younger monk began, slowly, to recognize the subtle yet unmistakable truth that compassion requires not only action but release. One must act, yes, but one must not cling to the act, nor to the consequences, nor to the judgments of self or others. It was an uncomfortable realization, a storm within a storm, but also a doorway. For in acknowledging the weight of what he felt, his confusion, his hesitation, his attachment, he had taken the first step toward understanding the depth of wisdom. Compassion was not a rule to be followed, it was a path to be walked, and sometimes walking that path meant stepping into uncertainty, into action without certainty, into the raw, unfolding reality of life itself. The river had calmed, the woman had vanished into the mist, and the monks, once separated by fear and doubt, now stood together on the bank, each immersed in their own awareness. One had acted and let go. The other had witnessed and begun the slow, transformative process of release. And though the younger monk did not yet fully understand, he felt deep within that something essential had shifted. A seed had been planted, a seed that would grow only with patience, reflection, and courage. The forest around them whispered softly in the aftermath, the rain having ceased completely, leaving only the gentle dripping from leaves and the occasional call of a bird. The world had continued, unchanged and yet entirely different. And in that quiet, the journey pressed forward, leading both monks, step by step, toward the questions that awaited them beyond the riverbank. Questions of heart, of discipline, and of the true nature of letting go. The young woman had disappeared into the misty forest, her figure swallowed by the rain-soaked trees, leaving the monks alone once more on the riverbank. The air, now fresh and cool, seemed to hum with quiet energy, as if the world itself were settling after witnessing what had just unfolded. The older monk remained calm, his robe still clinging to his body, his breath steady, his mind present. To him, the crossing had been simple, a compassionate act performed without attachment, completed and left behind. The younger monk, however, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, heavier than any stone or river current. His chest tightened, his thoughts raced, and his mind replayed every detail. The fear in the woman's eyes, the way the older monk had lifted her effortlessly, the silent gratitude she had offered before vanishing. Each memory was a ripple that refused to fade, a reminder that he was still holding onto something the other monk had already released. As they began walking again, the younger monk kept his gaze fixed on the muddy path, the forest, the river, anything but the older monk. Yet no matter where he looked, the image of the crossing lingered, insisting on attention. He realized slowly that the act itself was not the source of his unrest. It was the attachment, the inability to let go of what had already passed, the constant replaying of moments that could not be changed. The older monk, sensing the turbulence in his companion, spoke softly, almost to himself. "We carry many things that are no longer ours," he said, his eyes tracing the river's flow. "Some we place gently, some we clutch tightly, but all of them weigh the heart. To act is not enough. one must also release. The younger monk heard the words, but they did not yet settle in his mind. He had understood the rules, memorized the precepts, studied the teachings, and yet the challenge he faced now was not in knowledge, it was in living. Knowledge could not ease the tightness in his chest, could not release the restless echo of what had happened. Only understanding, deep and experiential, could do that. With each step along the forest path, he began to notice details he had previously ignored. The way the sunlight filtered through the wet leaves, the scent of damp earth rising from the soil, the gentle murmur of a distant stream. Slowly, he realized that the world had not stopped. It had continued, indifferent to his inner storm. And yet, in its indifference, there was a lesson. Life moves forward whether or not we are willing to let go. He glanced at the older monk who walked with effortless balance, as though the crossing had been no more than a passing thought. There was no pride in his steps, no attachment to the action, only a serene presence that seemed to emanate from every movement. And in that presence, the younger monk saw the embodiment of a truth he had yet to fully grasp. Wisdom is not measured by what we hold, but by what we release. They walked in silence for a while, the younger monk's mind churning with questions. How could one act so fully, so correctly, and yet remain untouched by the event? How could the older monk embrace the reality of the moment without clinging to it, without letting it disturb his inner balance? The answers were elusive, yet he sensed that each step forward, each quiet observation was bringing him closer. As the forest thinned and the path led them toward a small clearing, the younger monk began to notice something else. His own tension was slowly dissolving. Not entirely, not yet, but enough to feel the difference between holding and releasing. The act of compassion had been completed. The lesson now was to live with it without carrying it as a burden. The older monk, walking beside him, spoke again, this time with quiet clarity. Compassion without attachment is not measured by the act, but by the heart that performs it and then lets it go. The river flows, the rain falls, and the world continues. We are called only to be present, to act wisely, and to release what is no longer ours to hold. The younger monk inhaled deeply, allowing the words to settle within him, though the understanding was still budding. Fragile, like a seed just planted in fertile soil. He realized that crossing the river had not been merely an event. It had been a mirror, reflecting his own tendencies, his attachments, and his restlessness. The older monk had shown him the path not by instruction, but by example. Act with awareness, act with compassion, and then release. As the path led them deeper into the forest, the younger monk felt a subtle shift within himself. The storm that had raged in his chest was beginning to calm, replaced by a quiet curiosity, a willingness to observe, and a readiness to learn. He knew the journey was far from over. The river had been crossed, but the journey inward, the journey of understanding the mind and heart, was just beginning. The clearing ahead glimmered with the soft light of the waning day. Shadows stretched long, mingling with the mist that clung to the forest floor. The monks continued walking side by side, one steady, one learning, both moving through the wet and living world with awareness. And in that movement, the younger monk understood, in some small way, the first truth of letting go, that the river, the woman, and the act itself were behind him, yet their lesson would accompany him forever, shaping every step yet to come. The forest path grew quieter, though the whispers of the river still lingered in the younger monk's mind. Every sound, every shadow, every distant bird call seemed magnified, echoing the tumult within him. He had watched the older monk lift the woman effortlessly across the river, act with compassion, and then release the moment entirely. And yet he could not release it. The river, the woman, the act itself. They haunted him, looping in his thoughts with relentless persistence. He questioned himself. Had he acted correctly by staying behind? Had he failed in his duty? Or had the older monk transgressed some sacred boundary that he himself could not yet comprehend? The answers slipped through his fingers, elusive as the mist that clung to the forest floor. He stopped walking, letting the wet leaves sink beneath his feet, and gazed at the riverbank they had just crossed. The water moved steadily, indifferent to the turmoil it had inspired in him. "Why am I still carrying her?" he whispered, almost as if speaking aloud might reveal some hidden truth. The words felt heavy, loaded with confusion, judgment, and the subtle ache of guilt. In that silence, the younger monk began to see clearly the nature of his inner conflict. It was not simply about right or wrong. It was about attachment, his attachment to rules, to perceptions, to the rigid structure of his understanding. He had clung to the teachings like a shield, believing that adherence alone could protect him from error or suffering. Yet now he realized that clinging had trapped him in a river of his own making, keeping him from moving freely, from responding fully to the moment as it unfolded. The older monk noticed his companion's pause but did not speak. There was no need. True understanding could not be handed over like a gift. It had to be discovered, slowly, painfully, through the friction between expectation and reality. And so the younger monk wrestled with himself, grappling with the tension between what he had learned and what life demanded in that instant. He recalled the woman's eyes, wide, fearful, and full of silent appeal. And he recalled the older monk's face, serene and unshaken, moving through the river as if he were part of its flow. The contrast was unbearable, illuminating the gap between knowledge and lived wisdom. He had studied texts, memorized precepts, and disciplined his body and mind. Yet here he was, paralyzed by hesitation, unable to act, unable to release, and painfully aware of every ripple in his own heart. The forest around him seemed to pulse with expectation, as if the trees themselves were waiting for him to see what had been there all along. Slowly, the younger monk began to recognize the pattern. The struggle was internal. The river had crossed them both, yet only one had let go. One had acted and released, while the other continued to carry the moment like a stone pressed against his chest. It was a profound, unsettling insight. He realized that rules and teachings were not the river, they were the banks. They could guide, support, and contain, but they could not carry one across the water. The act of crossing, of engaging fully with life's demand, required more than knowledge. It required courage, clarity, and above all, release. The younger monk's mind wrestled with a subtle fear. If he acted, would he fail? If he let go, would he betray discipline? Yet deep within, a quieter voice began to speak, the voice that arises when attachment loosens its grip. It whispered that life's true measure is not in rigid adherence, but in the capacity to respond wisely and compassionately, then release without clinging. He continued walking, each step tentative, yet heavier with insight. He understood now that the river, the woman, and the act of compassion were mirrors, reflecting not the world outside, but the inner currents of his own heart. And the lesson he could no longer ignore was clear. Holding on to doubt, fear, and judgment would weigh him down far more than any act of courage or compassion ever could. The path ahead seemed longer than before, but in that length lay possibility. The younger monk felt the first stirrings of awareness that he could step forward differently, that he could meet life with presence, act with compassion, and then, crucially, release. The struggle was not yet over, but the seed of understanding had been planted, and it would grow only with patience, reflection, and experience. The forest whispered around him, the river flowed endlessly beside him, and in that harmony of movement and stillness, he began to sense a truth that would guide him far beyond this single crossing. Liberation is not in clinging, but in letting go. And so, though the inner storm had not yet passed, he walked forward, ready to confront the lessons the world and the river would offer next. The younger monk walked in silence, the forest around him bathed in soft light as the sun began to pierce the lingering mist. Each step felt different now, lighter, yet tinged with a newfound awareness of the weight he had carried. The crossing, the woman, and the older monk's effortless act of compassion continued to echo within him. And then slowly, the realization began to bloom. The older monk had crossed the river, yes, but he had left the woman behind. She had gone on her way, yet the memory of the moment remained a burden only because the younger monk refused to release it. They stopped at a small clearing where the river widened and reflected the sky like liquid glass. The older monk looked at his companion with quiet clarity. "Do you see it now?" he asked softly, his voice calm, free of judgment. "I carried her across the river, and then I left her. You, however, are still carrying her. Why?" The younger monk's breath caught, not in anger, but in recognition. He saw the truth reflected in the simple words, a truth that no teaching, no rule, and no manual could fully convey. Holding on to what no longer serves you only creates suffering. Compassion is not measured by clinging to actions or memories. It is realized when the heart can act with clarity and then release completely. The older monk continued, "Life will always ask you to cross rivers. Some are literal, some are not. Some will be easy, some nearly impossible. But the lesson remains the same. Act when the moment calls and let go once it has passed. Wisdom is not in the act alone. It is in the balance between engagement and release." The younger monk reflected on the statement, feeling the weight in his chest ease just slightly. He understood in a way that was more than intellectual that the attachment he had carried, the replaying of the river, the woman, the fear, the hesitation, had been unnecessary. He had been trapped by his own mind, believing that holding on could somehow provide control, certainty, or security. Yet the older monk had shown him the opposite. Release is not surrender to chaos, but alignment with reality, a clarity of action unburdened by clinging. The forest seemed to exhale along with him, the gentle rustling of leaves and the soft murmur of the river offering a subtle affirmation. Letting go, he realized, was not weakness. It was strength. It required courage to act, courage to feel, and courage to release all at once. It demanded awareness, mindfulness, and a deep trust in the flow of life. And it revealed that the true weight we carry is rarely the world outside. It is the attachment within our own hearts. The older monk smiled faintly, sensing the younger's growing insight. "See how the river flows?" he asked, gesturing toward the water. "It does not cling to the rocks. It moves around obstacles, embraces what it meets, and continues onward. Our hearts, too, can flow in this way. To carry unnecessary burdens is to fight against the current of life." The younger monk nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson. For the first time since the encounter, he felt a hint of release, a momentary clarity that illuminated the path ahead. He understood that wisdom was not simply the accumulation of knowledge or the meticulous adherence to rules. It was the ability to act fully, to respond with compassion, and to release completely, allowing life to move as it will. As they resumed their walk, the younger monk noticed the subtle shifts in his own awareness. His steps were no longer heavy with regret. His mind, though still active, carried a newfound quietness. The lesson of the river, the woman, and the older monk's simple act of compassion had settled deep within him, like a seed taking root in fertile soil. This wisdom, he realized, was not just for monks crossing rivers in the forest. It was a teaching for every moment of life. The challenges of attachment, the weight of regret, the restlessness of desire, they all arise in countless forms, each demanding awareness, courage, and release. And as long as he remembered this, he could walk through the world with clarity, presence, and compassion, free from the invisible burdens that had once weighed him down. The clearing seemed brighter now, the sunlight dancing on the river's surface, the forest alive with gentle movement. And in that light, the younger monk understood something profound. Letting go is not a single act. It is a continual practice. Each moment offers a new opportunity to release, to act with compassion, and to live with presence. It is the essence of freedom, the heart of wisdom, and the quiet strength that sustains those who walk the path fully awake. The river flowed before them, the forest whispered around them, and both monks continued their journey, one steady in the practice of release, the other beginning to understand its depth. And as they walked, the younger monk felt the subtle yet undeniable truth that would guide him far beyond the crossing. To act without attachment, to love without clinging, and to live with a heart free to flow like the river itself. The younger monk walked beside the older one, the forest thinning and the path opening to sunlight that filtered gently through the trees. The lesson of the river, the woman, and the act of compassion had taken root within him, but now a new question arose. How could the wisdom of letting go be applied beyond the river, beyond the forest, beyond this single moment? Life, he realized, is a series of rivers, some literal, some metaphorical. They are moments of fear, desire, attachment, and uncertainty that confront each of us every day. The act of compassion at the river was simple in its context, yet its principles were universal. Notice, act wisely, release fully. These principles, he began to understand, were not confined to monks crossing rivers. They could be applied in every interaction, every decision, every heartbeat. The older monk spoke, breaking the silence with a voice calm as the flowing water. "Consider your own life," he said. "How often do you carry burdens long after the moment has passed? How often do you cling to anger, to fear, to regret? To live fully is to act when the moment calls, and to let go when it has passed. This is the practice of mindfulness, of awareness, and of freedom." The younger monk nodded slowly, feeling the truth of the words resonate. He thought of daily life, the quarrels at home, the worries about work, the tension between friends, the endless replaying of past mistakes. Each of these moments, he realized, is a small river, sometimes raging, sometimes gentle, but always demanding our presence and our discernment. To act without attachment, to respond with compassion and clarity, and then to release, was the path to peace in everyday life. He began to see the practical applications unfold like petals of a flower. When anger arises, recognize it. Act wisely, speak with clarity, defend truth, but do not cling to resentment afterward. When desire or attachment appears, acknowledge it, act with understanding, and let go of the expectation that you can control outcomes. When fear or grief surfaces, feel it fully, offer compassion to yourself and to others, and release it when it no longer serves. The older monk continued, "We do not need grand gestures to practice wisdom. Every act, no matter how small, can be a river to cross. The principle remains: respond with awareness, act with compassion, and release with grace. In this way, the mundane becomes sacred, the ordinary becomes a teacher, and each moment a doorway to freedom." The younger monk reflected on these words as they walked. He began to notice the subtle ways he could practice letting go in his own life. Forgiving a friend without holding onto resentment, finishing a task without obsessing over perfection, listening to another without judgment, giving without expecting return. Each action, though small, became a rehearsal of the lesson learned at the river. He also realized that letting go does not mean passivity. It is not avoidance or indifference. It is engagement without attachment, action without clinging, love without possession. It is the balance between effort and surrender, the harmony of heart and mind aligned with the flow of life. As the monks emerged from the forest into open fields, the younger monk felt a sense of quiet liberation. The lesson of the river was no longer an abstract idea. It was alive within him, shaping his awareness and guiding his choices. The wisdom of letting go was now a living practice, a tool for navigating every river that life would present, whether literal or metaphorical. The older monk glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Remember," he said, "the river will always flow. Moments will always come and go. The question is, will you carry them, or will you let them pass? True freedom lies not in avoiding the river, but in learning to cross it, and release what is no longer yours to hold." The younger monk inhaled deeply, feeling the wind against his face, the sun on his shoulders, the earth beneath his feet. He understood now that life itself is a continuous practice of awareness, compassion, and release. Every interaction, every challenge, every joy and sorrow offers the opportunity to act fully, respond wisely, and let go. And in this understanding, he felt a subtle, enduring peace, a freedom born not from circumstance, but from the choice to live with an open heart and a mind unburdened by what must be released. The path stretched forward, bathed in the soft glow of afternoon light. The younger monk walked with steadier steps, no longer weighed by the river behind him, yet carrying its lesson forward. And in this movement, he realized that the journey is never truly about crossing rivers. It is about learning to navigate life with awareness, compassion, and the courage to let go. The The sun began its slow descent, casting long, golden rays across the fields and forest edges. The monks walked in near silence, each step carrying the weight and clarity of the day's lessons. The river, now distant but ever present in memory, had offered more than a simple act of compassion. It had become a mirror, reflecting not only the world outside but the deepest currents within their hearts. The older monk glanced at his companion, his gaze calm and steady, as if inviting the younger monk to look inward. "Sit for a moment," he suggested, gesturing to a shaded clearing beneath an ancient tree. The younger monk obeyed, settling onto the soft earth, feeling the lingering warmth of the day and the gentle pulse of the world around him. Silence enveloped them, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. In this quiet, the younger monk turned inward, examining the stirrings of his mind. He saw clearly now the subtle ways he had carried attachments, how he had clung to fear, hesitation, and judgment long after the moments had passed. He saw the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between following rules and living the teachings. The older monk's presence was steady, like the earth beneath them. He spoke softly, not to instruct, but to guide reflection. Life will continue to offer rivers, challenges that demand more than intellect. Each one is an invitation to act fully, to respond wisely, and to let go. Reflection allows us to see where we cling, where we resist, and where freedom waits to be embraced. The younger monk nodded slowly, feeling the truth of the words seep into him. He recalled the woman on the riverbank, the fear in her eyes, the effortless compassion of his companion, and the tension that had gripped him so tightly afterward. Every detail was now a teacher, every memory a lesson in awareness and release. He realized that reflection was not merely thinking, it was the conscious examination of one's own heart and mind, a practice as essential as any ritual or meditation. He closed his eyes and let the day's events unfold within him, one by one. The river, once a source of tension, became a symbol of impermanence. The woman became a symbol of need, vulnerability, and the call to respond with presence. The older monk became a living example of wisdom, showing that action and release are inseparable, that compassion without attachment is the heart of true practice. In this reflection, he began to notice subtle shifts in himself, the loosening of tightness in his chest, the softening of judgment toward himself and others, the awakening of a curiosity that was patient rather than restless. He understood more deeply than before that contemplation was not passive. It was an active engagement with reality, a deliberate act of turning inward to integrate experience, to see clearly, and to cultivate clarity and compassion. The older monk spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Contemplation is the bridge between action and understanding. Without it, our deeds may be well-intentioned but shallow. With it, even the smallest act becomes infused with awareness, compassion, and wisdom. The river teaches, but reflection allows the lesson to settle into the heart. The younger monk inhaled deeply, feeling the rhythm of his own breath, the steady beat of his heart, and the pulse of life surrounding him. He realized that the journey was not about perfection or adherence to rigid rules. It was about the continuous practice of awareness, the courage to act, the ability to release, and the willingness to look inward honestly. Each moment, each encounter, each challenge was an opportunity to cultivate wisdom and compassion, to integrate the teachings fully into life. As the light softened and shadows deepened, he opened his eyes and met the gaze of his companion. No words were necessary. The reflection had done its work. The lesson had taken root. The younger monk felt a subtle, enduring sense of alignment, an understanding that the path of practice is not a series of discrete events, but an ongoing journey of mindful presence, compassionate action, and thoughtful reflection. The river's lesson, the woman's presence, the older monk's example, they had converged into a single, flowing truth. Freedom and wisdom arise not from avoiding life's challenges, but from engaging them fully, acting with compassion, and releasing without attachment. And in this moment of contemplation, the younger monk glimpsed the profound simplicity at the heart of the practice, a clarity that would guide him beyond the river, beyond the forest, and into every river he would ever encounter in life. The sun had dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose as the monk stood at the edge of the river once more. The water flowed steadily, indifferent to the events of the day, carrying leaves and ripples alike toward places unseen. It was a river that had offered much more than a crossing. It had offered a mirror, a lesson, and a living example of the delicate balance between action and release. The younger monk looked at his companion, the older monk who had quietly demonstrated what it meant to live with compassion and clarity. In that moment, he understood something profound. Wisdom is not the accumulation of knowledge, nor the memorization of precepts, nor the rigid adherence to rules. True wisdom is the ability to perceive the needs of the moment, to act with awareness, and then to release without attachment. It is a harmony of heart, mind, and action that flows as naturally as the river itself. The lessons of the river, the woman, and the crossing had rippled through the younger monk's consciousness. He realized that holding onto fear, judgment, or regret was like trying to stop the river with his hands. Only by letting go, by trusting the flow, could he move freely, fully, and compassionately through life. He felt the subtle liberation that arises when one acts rightly and releases completely, the quiet peace of alignment with the rhythm of existence. The older monk spoke softly, almost as if the river itself were speaking through him. Remember, the world will continue to offer rivers, challenges that demand your attention and action. Each is an opportunity to practice awareness, compassion, and release. Wisdom is not found in avoiding difficulty, but in meeting it fully, responding with clarity, and letting go of what cannot be held. The younger monk inhaled deeply, feeling the rhythm of his own breath, the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, and the ever-present flow of the river. He understood now that life's true weight is not in the challenges themselves, but in the attachments we carry, the clinging, the hesitation, the fear that binds the heart. Wisdom, he realized, is the freedom to act without clinging, to love without possession, and to live with a mind unburdened by what must be released. As the evening deepened, the river's surface reflected the last light of day, shimmering with subtle beauty. The monks turned to continue their journey along the forest path, side by side, their steps in harmony with the flow of life. One walked with the calm assurance of experience, the other with the awakening understanding of lessons learned. Together, they moved forward, carrying not burdens but the wisdom of presence, compassion, and release. And as the river continued to flow, unceasing, unstoppable, and indifferent to the world around it, the younger monk finally understood. The true meaning of wisdom is living fully in the present, acting with a heart open to compassion, and letting go of all that no longer serves the soul. Life, like the river, moves forward. It asks nothing, demands nothing, yet offers everything. To act with awareness, to respond with compassion, and to release without attachment. This is the path. This is the teaching. This is the freedom that lies within each moment, flowing endlessly, inviting all who are willing to step into the current and discover the quiet, profound peace of true wisdom. As we walk through the rivers of life, may we remember to act with compassion, release what no longer serves us, and move forward with a heart open to wisdom. If this journey resonated with you, and you wish to explore more teachings that nurture the mind and heart, consider subscribing to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Together, we can continue learning, reflecting, and discovering the quiet strength that lies within every moment.